Hope everybody's having a good Friday and really enjoying that weather that's outside. As a matter of fact, I need to get outside and enjoy some of that weather at some point or another. As a matter of fact, I was talking to my very special guest earlier today about the need to have those many irons in the fire, but also to try to have that balance act and to try to get some time for yourself. And all along those lines, it can be a difficult thing to do, particularly when you, like myself, come from a family of activists and a family that has been involved in a number of things since a young age. As a matter of fact, one of the places that I work at is the Hayti Heritage Center, which is an African American cultural arts center where I am one of the historians. We have another one that's more of a traveling kind of like exhibit, well, traveling history where they'll come and grab you and then walk you through some of the Black Wall Street neighborhoods here in Durham and some of the other neighborhoods. They even do one around Pauli Murray. And I know that my guests will know who Pauli Murray is and all along those lines. So she was a great activist in both the feminist movement as well as in the LGBTQIA movement and all along those lines. It was very much involved in the whole notion of what's going on with Brown versus Board of Education. Matter of fact, she did a lot of that groundwork that was set in that space and everything. And I just got a reminder of how, even though the gray beard is here and all along those lines, I'm hitting that lovely 60s age and all in that space, that it can be quite interesting when you see pictures of what you imagine would be people that are still maintaining their youthful look and all along those lines, but you know that they are in their 80s, much as I know that my parents are in their 80s and the great activist Howard Fuller is in his 80s. But there's a current exhibit that's going up, but already some early pictures have come from Billy Barnes, who is a local photographer, and one of those pictures was of a young Howard Fuller. So anybody that knows activism and knows charter school movements and even knows some of the original Black Lives Matter case, like the Ernie Lacy case that took place in Milwaukee, knows who Howard Fuller is and all in that space. But it was a young Howard Fuller, probably in his 20s at that time of the picture and all along those lines. And yesterday we had a yoga class going on, which is now going on every Thursday. They moved partially because of me, because usually the online dinner party is on Wednesday. And that was also the day of my show, and I didn't want to interfere with the show. So they decided that they would be kind and move to the yoga to Thursday from Wednesday so that I could still do my online dinner party on Wednesdays and all along those lines. But this is a special edition of that show. But there was a young 4-year-old lady that was there at that particular event with her mom taking yoga. And I asked the child or the mother how old the young girl was. And I think she said she was 6 or something like that and everything. And I realized, no, she was 4. And I realized that I was 6. Well, actually, I was 5 getting ready to be 6, because the picture was taken in April and all along those lines, when that picture of Howard looking up at what he thought was snipers, or maybe some people called it trouble because it was after King and others had been assassinated and everything like that. And it turned out that it was a plainclothes policeman that was trying to keep security as they were doing a protest in kind of a counter protest to some of the hatred that was going on in the 60s and all along those lines. So I was just telling that young lady that, wait a minute, you are, like I said, 6. I think I was a 4, I should say. I think I was 5.5, because the picture was taken in April. I'm born in July. So 5 3/4, we'll say 5 and something like that. At the time that the picture was taken, I'm good. Like, I got gray hair and I look much older than even Howard does in that picture and all in that space. But he does look very youthful in that picture. And there were some other pictures, even of Hamlet, where John Coltrane is from, and all along those lines. But like I said, come from that whole notion of activism, parents having been started a community radio station when I was a teenager in Warrenton, North Carolina. And Warrenton, North Carolina is kind of the home of the environmental justice movement because of the dumps that took on in that area and all along those lines. And even the year after the picture was taken that I'm referring to, my brother was born in 1969. And that was, I think, born on the same day as the dedication of the Malcolm X school, because there was a Malcolm X school that existed here in Durham for a while as well. And my parents were involved in that. So that's just some of their activism. I'll be talking to Aaliyah, hope I pronounced it correctly and everything, Dastagir, like a car gear, and all along those lines, and hearing some of her own background in activism and how she got involved in it. I even remember one time protesting as a student because I didn't like the lineups that were going on with, were like an inspection of your ears or something like that. And I think I got my parents behind me in order to not go do those lineups and everything like that. And then my parents actually yanked me from school, and I was homeschooled for 2 years when we were up in Warrenton, because I was wanting to be one of those people like, I don't like this whole notion of being having to do a mandatory line, even though it's something that was for our health and all along those lines. But I'm gonna find out from Aaliyah some of her thoughts and what she's got going on and all in that space. But Aaliyah, I know you're doing some amazing work that is talking about what's going on. And I did mention Pauline Murray, so I don't know how familiar you are with Pauline Murray, but she has a center here in Durham, and she was one of the leading people behind the whole notion of Brown versus Board of Education. Is seen as an advocate in the LGBTQIA community as well, because even though I don't know that it was ever fully put out that she was a part of that community, I think most people that are scholars think that she was a member of that community and all along those lines and everything. But it was definitely a center, and they just recently got noticed. I know Jesse Huddleston, who's a friend of mine, is concerned because they just got noticed that $330,000, which is a lot for a new organization, have been pulled from that organization because of they had all this federal government money that was helping. And I know they've been threatening the Smithsonian, including the African American Museum and everything, but they literally pulled that 330,000. But they are resolute that they will stay in business and will continue the work of Pauline Murray, because they knew that Pauline Murray was a fighter. So Jesse and Angela Thorpe, who is the head of that organization, Jesse's the head of the board and everything, are resolute that they will maintain the center for its historical legacy, but also maybe doing some of that advocacy work that she was doing even with the center and its research.
Mark, my goodness, thanks for having me. I feel like I just got this like amazing, unexpected, rapid macro history lesson. Like that was something. I am familiar with Pauline Murray. I was thinking about her term Jane Crow, which we can certainly, and I'll give you a little bit about my background, but definitely want to talk about my work and this sort of specific sort of texture of the way that Black women, right, experience the kind of violence that I'm reporting on in the book. So I think you referred to me as an activist. I'll make a small correction. I think that I identify as a journalist, but it's interesting. Yesterday was the first time that I did an interview where I did refer to myself as a feminist writer. And I do think that is something different, right? And that's not something that I've ever sort of publicly claimed until recently. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think if you look at my byline and if you end up picking up this book, you'll see that I write with a point of view, a specific point of view, and that point of view being that all people, I believe, deserve to live lives free of violence. And so I was a reporter at USA Today for a little more than 10 years, and I was covering gender, race, how identity sort of intersected with politics. Towards the end, I was almost exclusively covering mental health, which, you kind of can't really talk about racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, any of those things and not talk about mental health. But I came to journalism. It's interesting just because you were talking about, your history. I was thinking like how I ended up just in journalism, period. I think my mom was a big fan when I was growing up of Christiane Amanpour, the journalist Christiane Amanpour. And I think I remember just like her being in bed and like watching her on TV and just being like, oh, she's so amazing. So I'm sure, I internalized some of that. And then my dad is an immigrant from Afghanistan, and he came here as a teenager. And he has said this to me so many times over the years, and I'm sure I also internalized this, but when he would talk about sort of respectable professions that he respected, he always talked about journalism. He said it is among the most important sort of professions, and I would imagine he had a deep appreciation for the way that journalism is so vital to our democracy. So I think that I'm sure that my parents played a role. And I also I love to write. And I don't like writing fiction. So this seemed like a really sort of natural fit in terms of being able to write every day. But I don't think that I fully understood sort of the power of journalism and how crucial it is until I was in a newsroom. Like, I think that my respect for the profession has just grown as it's expanded right through my own experience, and then especially now, just thinking about the attacks on journalists, specifically on the institution of journalism. So just to kind
You're
of bring it
raising
back
so
to,
many interesting questions, and I can't wait
oh,
to delve into all of these that you're raising and everything
yeah,
along those lines. Because one thing that you were saying that really caught my ear and everything was you mentioned the attacks on journalism, and even on this network, we've been talking about how certain people in certain newer administrations, namely the Trump administration, have been targeting like the PBS and the NPRs of the world, but not just leaving it at that, because they've also targeted CBS and ABC, not giving them access to certain things that are going on, including the press conferences. And I'm sure you probably were in some of those press rooms in past White Houses and all along those lines. But I just wanted your take on this. In my, like you said, it's an attack on journalism. It's been an attack on journalism for a while, and particularly under the last Trump administration and this Trump administration as well. But I just wanted your take on that, because it seems like even some of the American people are being complacent, if I can use that term,
yeah,
in letting it happen and all in that space. And like you, I grew up but it was in the 60s and 70s, being a fan of journalism. So I knew at a fairly young age that I was going to be in journalism. Ironically, at one time I thought I was going to be a weatherman, because I thought it was really cool looking out at the weather. Looking at the weather and the clouds, and I even had my own little barometer and everything. But I also loved reporting, so I was on my school newspaper in high school and in college at the Marquette Tribune and everything. But I had a great deal of respect for investigative journalists, people like Walter Cronkite. I mean, regular
yeah,
anchors like Walter Cronkite, but also the
sure,
investigative journalists of the 60 Minutes era, and even like Charles Carroll and a number of others. So I had a big love of those kind of journalists of the past, including like David Brinkley and others along those lines, and even Barbara Walters, even though she would get teased, because sometimes people would say that she would ask frivolous questions, even though I didn't always find those questions frivolous, because there was that whole nickname of Barbara Wawa and all along those lines that was out there. But I was just wondering your take on journalism and its role in society. And to me, journalism and activism kind of go hand in hand, but that's just me.
sure,
So I can
yeah,
understand why you wouldn't consider yourself an activist, but I do think that journalists, and to some degree, I think of journalists as historians. And like I said, I'm a historian for a cultural center, but I think that journalists are also the historians, because you're writing down information that the historians will later study, and everything is about you're
sure,
doing it simultaneously
yeah.
and everything. So I just wanted your take on the importance of journalism.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a healthy functioning democracy without journalists. Like, it just doesn't. You can't hold powerful people accountable. You can't expose corruption. You can't get to the truth of a matter. You can't you can't keep communities healthy without journalism. And certainly what we're seeing now, there's much to critique, right, about sort of certainly mainstream journalism and the ways that we had failed, right, sort of back in 2015. I mean, we're always making mistakes, right? But that's the interesting thing, is we have to be transparent about it in the way that like some other kinds of institutions don't have to be. But yes, we've made many mistakes, I think, especially covering the 2016 election, and I think that that sort of, and I think people know that. And so I think some of that has been exploited, right, to create antagonism and sort of skepticism around the press. Certainly what we see now, you mentioned all of the institutions that Trump and his administration are, have their eye on. I mean, he's suing, I think now I read he's suing CBS, or threatened to sue CBS. He's suing the Des Moines Register. So these attacks are incredibly strategic. I mean, this is right. Like, this is to undermine the press makes him more powerful. And I'm a little reluctant to go back this far, because I'm not a historian. But just thinking about the time period where you were discussing, where you were where your sort of admiration for journalists and journalism is really kind of flourishing. Nixon had a very antagonistic relationship with journalists and journalism too. And I think the New York Times, on their podcast, The Daily, was talking about some of the kind of similarities in terms of that moment, right, in history and this moment. But there are, I think, good reasons to be incredibly worried. Not only do you see this administration attacking institutions, the institution of journalism and the specific sort of, publications, but they're also attacking individual journalists. And I think that this is a really, excellent way into kind of talking about my book and this project, because for me, this project began with attacks that I was experiencing as a journalist in a newsroom for reporting on topics that certain readers did not want me to report on, or not in the way that I was reporting on them. And in 2022, I sort of experienced my online abuse my book is about women and online abuse. My abuse really ramped up 2016, 2017. So first Trump election, at the time where I'm sort of reporting a lot on kind of feminism under Trump. What is feminism going to look like under Trump? So I'm getting a lot of abuse around that. And then it continued. And then in 2022, I wrote a story that led to my first experience of coordinated online harassment. That campaign was launched by QAnon, and Donald Trump Jr., who did not name me specifically, but he kind of got on that outrage train, right? And was posting about the story that I had written. And I think it's, so in that experience, I had a bunch of people online attacking me by name. You had an incredibly powerful figure, criticizing my work. And of course, he's got to know the consequences, right, of doing that. He's got to know that when he does that, people are going to come for me. And the ultimate, and the sort of the consequence of that, right, is that I am terrified, and I start to question, right, like my next story. Am I going to report on that topic again, that I got all that sort of abuse about? So this whole conversation that we're having, the impact is silencing, right? It's narrowing the stories that we're telling. It's curtailing the questions that we ask as a society, and it's limiting the kind of conversations we can have about how to make the most healthy society possible. So I see this current moment as deeply destabilizing, distressing, ominous.
When you use the word troubling and everything like that. Just really quickly, just to interrupt you slightly and everything along those lines. One of the founders of the network, Kim Calhoun, we were actually just talking about this earlier and everything, and we talked about it earlier on our news show, World Edition, and all along those lines. But do you think that sometimes journalists are afraid to cover stories and everything? Because she is a big advocate, and part of it is because of thinking that there are some names, including maybe even some leadership names, that need to be uncovered and everything. But she really wants and she said it several times on our network, Pod TV, and I think that she has a valid point, wants the Epstein files released and everything like that. Been advocating for that heavily on this network and everything. But I think that some people kind of push back against it because of fear of what kind of things that could unleash and what kind of destabilization they can do. I think that I like Kim thinks that there's probably some things that need to be released that are in those files. But I like to say she's been pushing for this now for I should argue probably several years, but definitely pushing it heavily several weeks lately and everything. So I just wanted your take on this notion of, are we sometimes too timid in going after what the old investigative journalists used to do?
Well, I guess I would say a couple of things on that. So I did a few investigations while I was at USA Today, but I wouldn't call myself an investigative reporter. So I don't know that I can comment like on that sort of, that kind of piece, right? With a lot of authority, but certainly what I can speak to is fear of retaliation. So my book on women and online abuse really, it's hard to figure out like where a project starts. So so there were many kind of starting points, I think, but one of them was that I came across, to your point, a statistic from the International Women's Media Foundation, and it was from a report that they had done on harassment of women online. And one of the findings was so stunning to me. They found that of women who had an experience of harassment online, 40% avoided reporting certain stories as a result of it. Now, that is a huge number, and that really speaks to some of what you're saying. And I think that, I'm trying very much in my work now to ground us in the sort of human costs of these things. So yes, absolutely, we are journalists, and we should be dogged about the truth, about uncovering the truth. And that's the, sort of, I guess, the kind of like the oath, right, that we take and the promise that we make to a public. But we are human beings. We are human beings, and we have human bodies and human brains and physiology. And, there are all sorts of things that happen to a person, to a body, right? When you are attacked for your work, when you are threatened because of the work that you do, it's not easy to, nor should you necessarily have to, completely compartmentalize or sort of disassociate from that or suppress that, because you're a person, right? We are journalists, that's our profession, but we are also people. And I think that's a big finding of mine in this book, which is that, these attacks have real meaningful consequences, not only for individual women, but for society, for our democracy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But along those same lines, and I was wondering your thoughts around this. I've only had the pleasure, well, if you want to count the column work that I did, twice work at a daily newspaper. I worked at a variety of other newspapers and other media outlets and all along those lines. But I did work briefly at a daily newspaper, which was the Boca Raton News and everything like that. And then I had a column briefly at the News and Observer, which is our Raleigh newspaper. I think it lasted for less than a half a year and all along those lines. But while I was at the Boca Raton News, I remember that there was a fellow African-American journalist. And one of the things that I felt that was happening, and I just wanted your thoughts as a woman, because there was I want to say she was a Latin woman there, was that sometimes journalists, and particularly those that are in leadership in journalists, like being the big fish in the small pond. And sometimes they do a good job of undermining people that are of like-minded backgrounds and everything like that. So I just wondered if that's part of your online experience, even at the USA Today. So did you find other women that were encouraging, or other groups of minorities that were encouraging? Because like I said, there was one gentleman, I don't even know if he's still living or if he's still in journalism and everything, but I did feel that he was undermining me in some ways because he liked being the big fish in that small pond around Boca Raton. And I also think that the woman that I want to say was a Latin woman at the time had similar feelings and everything. So I just wondered, did you feel that you got support in the media from fellow minorities?
That's a great question. So, okay, I think that some of this, I can only answer from my, this is, you're asking a personal question, so I can only answer personally. I did not have I don't have, compared to some journalists, right, an incredibly sort of robust online following, right, which is like where in a lot of cases you can get a lot of that sort of social support when you're kind of being attacked, and in the ways that, I was sort of just discussing these sort of online attacks. And so it can be difficult because you get attacked in these spaces and then you don't really have, like, the attacks are much louder, fiercer, like feel stronger, right? Than the whatever support you might kind of be getting, because there's just so many more people. There's more antagonists, right, than kind of people supporting you. I would say that within my newsroom, I definitely felt like my women colleagues of color understood when I would get attacked for a story, understood what I was dealing with more acutely than anybody. And honestly, I had a woman of color who, this woman would reliably, every time I wrote a story, when she could, even if she didn't see necessarily the attacks, because sometimes they're coming in through your email, they're just in my mentions, but she was savvy enough to know, okay, this is a kind of story that's going to agitate, right, certain people. And she would send me a personal message just almost after every story like that, just being like, you know what, I just want to let you know that your work is so important, and you know, I value you, and I hope you're okay. Like, just that kind of message. She was so reliable about it. And I think that was the case. And I think that, you know, some of the women of color that I that worked in my newsroom, I would see also, you know, it was really tough because this, you know, the problem of women in online abuse is almost always framed as a problem of misogyny. It's just sexism. But then you kind of see what you see what the Black women in the newsroom are dealing with, and they're not just being called a sexist slur, they're being called house slaves. So not only did I feel like these women understood my experience, and often, you know, offered sort of support and empathy and solidarity to the extent that they could, but I also felt like they were having their own very specific experience that was different, right, from my own, because I was not facing precisely what they were facing. They were facing a different intersection, right? They were facing sexism, racism, misogynoir, something very different. So I think that's a roundabout way of sort of answering your question, which is to say that I did feel supported by my colleagues of color, but I think that through the reporting of this book, I realized maybe the ways that I had failed to support them by not fully appreciating the differences in the ways, you know, we were being silenced.
Yeah. Well, and I should know this, but I'm going to be fair in my own lack of knowledge on some things and everything along those lines. But I know, because I'm a member of it, even though I'm not an active member, I probably need to pay my membership dues of NABJ, which is the National Association of Black Journalists and everything. But are there a lot of organizations that help women journalists, and even in dealing with the online abuse and even their unfair treatment within the newsroom? And is there any organization that you would recommend that women journalists, or just ladies that are in journalism, get involved with, that are actively supporting the women in the field?
I can tell you two just off the top of my head. Well, I have a few things. So two off the top of my head are one I mentioned already, the International Women's Media Foundation. They are working to educate, protect, train, not just journalists here, but, you know, around the world. I think that they are, you know, I support their mission. I think that what they're doing is incredible. And I encourage every woman who's having an experience of online, women journalists who are having experiences of online abuse, I think that you'll find that organization to be extremely resourceful. I think PEN America is also I got such a good education from them when I was reporting on this book. They have so many, they do their own research and have so many resources, self-care resources, just very practical resources in terms of, you know, there are sort of psychological mitigations to help cope with this, which is what I write about. But there's also, you know, technological tools, tech tools that we have to sort of try to protect ourselves from this kind of abuse and prepare for it. And so they're a great resource on that. You know, I think newsrooms are getting better. I mean, my newsroom, I would say, has gotten much better with this over the 10 years that I was there. I remember when it first started to kind of happen to me, I was, I didn't even know who to go to. Like, I told the editor and we would kind of talk about it, but it didn't even occur to me to report it to the platform. It was such a, it was haphazard, and we didn't. But by the end of my time there were formalized trainings that were aimed at women in the newsroom to help them prepare. And I think that the preparation is such a huge thing too. It's not, by the time these attacks, especially if it's a coordinated attack, by the time these attacks are kind of underway, you're sort of at the mercy of it, right? Like they're going to go on for as long as they go on. They have kind of a, like they cycle out right after a couple of days. But there's kind of little you can do. The best thing you can do is prepare in advance to be like, okay, I know, or I suspect that this is a story that, if you're reporting on the far right, or you're reporting on, a group of conspiracy theorists, whatever it is, that that I'm probably going to get, it's going to be bad, right? After you take steps ahead of time so that you're not caught off guard. It's much better to prepare. And I think that at least my own newsroom I can speak to was much better at preparing journalists by the time I left to write this book.
That makes a lot of sense. Everything. How much do you think the isms play on each other and work with each other? And I'll explain what I mean by that, but I'm going to go to TV news instead of print media and everything, because I do have some friends that are in both radio and television and everything like that. But I know that sometimes ageism can play a role, because sometimes women are escorted away from the newsrooms, like the being the lead figure in the newsroom once they get older and all along those lines. And I'm not sure how that still plays in the newsroom as much, even though I do have some friends in print journalism as well and everything like that. But I do know that that's been an accusation that's been out there for a while, that as man can be in their 70s and other ages and everything and still be the main anchors. But whereas women for a while, and I think it's still the case, are kind of eased out after they get maybe into their 30s and 40s and everything. So I was wondering if that was something that the book touches on in terms of the ways, because I'm sure the TV journalists are also catching some online abuse as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So to answer, no, I mean, I don't really talk about, I guess I don't really talk about ageism specifically, but what you're saying, I mean, implicit in that, right, is sexism, right? Because it's something that women are attacked for in a way that men aren't. I certainly interviewed women who were attacked mostly around their appearance, right? So even if we're not broadcast journalists, we do things like this, right? I'm a print journalist, but I come on here and I talk to you and here's my face. And so certainly I think that it's almost an issue for any journalist in this kind of environment, right? Where we're all sort of being asked to be not just reporters, but also sort of, I don't know, ambassadors of the newsroom, ambassadors of our story, right? We are expected to kind of go on and do these things. And I can say it's really hard. I went to Syracuse for my degree in journalism. And back then, I don't know what the breakdown is now of like how the degrees work, but back then it was magazine, newspaper, and online. Then there was broadcast. It was like a separate track. So magazine, newspaper, and online was one track. Broadcast was another track. Maybe television and film was another track. But anyway, it was so interesting because they were separate. They were totally separate things, right? Like broadcast was totally separate from, and now that's just not the case. So I think that absolutely women, reporters are experiencing sexism, ageism, racism, attacks on our appearance, sexualized attacks, right? A lot of the attacks against women are really sort of sexualized. That's kind of one of the thing that sort of differentiates it, right, from some of the attacks that men get. But yeah, I think that right now it's interesting. I think that even though absolutely those attacks can still be incredibly frustrating and difficult and painful to constantly have your appearance be the thing that is kind of called out. I also think that the problem of online abuse has evolved in such a way where I don't know if women have necessarily accommodated to that kind of abuse or criticism, but I think that what I hear bothering women that I interview is not really at this point attacks on their appearance, like, because it's almost like, I don't know. I don't know. That wasn't what I heard kind of in my reporting. It was something different. It was like because the attacks are more strategic now. They're more coordinated. They're more, they're smarter, right? Like they're not just telling you that you look bad. They're using disinformation and misinformation to sort of justify large scale online attacks against you in ways that undermine your reputation, right? That have economic consequences for you. If you're a person who's, you have an appearance, right? You're going to be a keynote speaker at a conference, but you just got a lot of heat from Fox News or whatever it was. Maybe the conference is like, you know what, actually, we don't really want you to come because we don't want that heat. And then you lose an opportunity. So, which is all to say that it's a totally fair question. I think that the problem has evolved in such a way that the things that are sort of that are most harmful to women in these spaces are not necessarily what was most harmful, 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah. How much do you think, because, it is part of the new landscape, and like I said, I don't have any. I know you've got a young one because I've read some of the background on you and everything. I don't have any kids of my own, but I do have 2 nephews, and I know that sometimes they can be glued to their social media. And I know a lot of friends are into social media and all along those lines. And even some of the attacks you mentioned, QAnon, and some of those. And I used to be active on Clubhouse and everything. Oftentimes come from the social media spaces and everything like that. So, what is your take on social media and its role in some of these attacks, and whether it's against women or it's against folks just in general and everything? But it does seem like sometimes people think that they have more permission to say some of the things that they do that they might not say you directly in your face and everything.
Yeah, I mean, that, I think I was mentioning earlier that some of the abuse as a journalist, some of the abuse would come directly to me by way of email. But most of it was made possible through social media platforms. And that, because that's where that outrage kind of finds community, right? And other people, an audience, and can really be harnessed and sort of weaponized, right? To sort of go after a person. So, I mean, social media is, it is a problem with social media. I think sometimes we sort of colloquially might say like, oh, it's the internet. Like, it's social media. It's like what we're talking about when we talk about how, it's what we're referring to, right? When we kind of talk about how the barrier to becoming a threat to someone has been lowered so much. These platforms have made that really possible. And I think the challenge, there is a part of me that recognizes there's a difference, right, between the people who sort of, the big tech CEOs who sort of run these platforms and the people who work there, right? Because I think that, we can, we pay very close attention to what Mark Zuckerberg is saying and doing, what Elon Musk is saying and doing. And, back in January, Zuckerberg announced that Facebook was loosening rules that govern hate and abuse on their platform. That affects Facebook, that affects Threads, that affects Instagram. They also, own WhatsApp. So, those kinds of things get a lot of attention. When Elon Musk bought X, he came in and brought back all these accounts that had been banned, right? From like people who had been associated with Nazis or white supremacists, really, really tough folks. But I think that, it's also true that a lot of people who work at these companies recognize that they don't want these platforms to have such an antagonistic relationship with users, and they do care, right, about the experiences that people are having on their platforms. But they only have so much power, right? They only have so much control, and so it's tough. I think that one of the women that I interviewed for the book said to me that she sort of thought about, in terms of trying to reform these platforms, she thought about it as kind of the next site of union activism, almost kind of walking off of these platforms to the extent that you can, right? Some people, I don't necessarily feel like this about my own work and livelihood, but certainly some people rely on these platforms they make a living, or it's also certainly true that there are people who would otherwise, who wouldn't have had a voice, like who wouldn't have had a platform, who wouldn't be able to speak or report or do the excellent work that they're doing to try to make people wiser and more reflective, if not for these platforms. You can't, sort of discount them completely. They're good, they're bad, they're helpful, they're harmful. But I think that it's worth sort of examining your relationship to these platforms and to what extent you feel they are useful to you, sort of personally and professionally. And if you feel like it is causing you more harm than it's worth, like, there's nobody compelling you to, they exist because we use them, right? Like, there's no one compelling you to sort of be here, and there's, there isn't really any incentive for them to do anything differently if we all just kind of stay and accept things that are totally unacceptable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and everything. But I guess one of the arguments that people make, and I think you even brought it up on one of the articles I read on you and everything, is this notion that a lot of times, particularly in the generation that is even before my generation, they'll just try to disconnect. My mother doesn't even have her own Facebook account. She has a late sister, and she'll get on that account if she needs to find out what me and my brother and her grands are doing and all along those lines. I know some other people that are totally disconnected as well as everything, or at least try to be as less connected. And you even sometimes hear people that when they are frustrated say that they need some time away from their devices and away from all the noise and chatter and everything like that. So how easy do you find it to be disconnected, and can you just avoid those people that are targeting you, or is it not as easy as people think? Because I think one of the articles I read, it might have even been with your article in USA Today and everything, you mentioned this notion of it's not that easy just to turn away from the online violence as a form of self-protection, and it might be a moral imperative to face it head on.
I think that there's a couple of things I think when you say that. Let's see if I can keep track of my thoughts. I mean, I think that, it's not easy to log off because these technologies are made to keep you there, right? That's what the algorithm is for. Like, it is to keep you as engaged and as outraged or whatever feeling as much as you possibly can be feeling, and to keep you captive, right? On these platforms. So there's a reason why it's really hard to look away and to walk away. That's their model, right? To kind of keep you there. I also think that it's really, in suggesting that you can just log off from it, you're sort of suggesting that all of this is kind of, not you, but like that suggestion is, it sort of makes it seem like this is just an online problem, that the kind of abuses that we're facing and the oppression that we're experiencing and the violence, the difficulty, the attacks, that it is just an online problem. And that's just not true. I mean, you and I are here today in this very fraught political moment where, people are being disappeared, right, and deported for speaking freely, where women's reproductive rights are being rolled back, where they're putting up even more barriers to, for certain people to be able to vote, right? So this isn't, this isn't just an online problem, right? I think about that. We're in this post-Roe world, and we're offline having these fights for reproductive rights and justice. And at the same time, online, you have these platforms blurring out information about abortion pills or taking down videos about people speaking about abortion rights. This is all just to say that it's connected, right? I remember when I was I hadn't sold the book yet. I was still working on like a book proposal. So when you do a nonfiction book, you're trying to sell your idea. And I remember I was talking about the book, and I was to myself and to other people, I said, it's a book about women and online abuse. And during that time period, I don't know if you remember this story. I think it was in 2020, but it was Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was at the U.S. Capitol, and she said that former Rep. Ted Yoho called her, I don't know if I can say the word here, but he called her a slur on the steps of the U.S. Capitol. He said it.
I think it was the word that rhymes with which.
You got it. Ducking. The first word rhymed with ducking, and the second one rhymed with witch. So. And I remember thinking at that moment, and she gave this, I encourage everybody to listen to the speech that she made after this, because that speech was so good. It was so vital. It was so on point. And she was talking about that. She was like, it's not about this one person saying this thing to me. She's like, I'm a woman. I ride the subway. Okay. I've worked in bars. I've thrown men out of bars who talk to me this way. It's not about this one person saying this thing. It is about a culture of violence and a normalization of violence. And the fact that Rep. Ted Yoho was walking shoulder to shoulder with another representative when he said that. And I think it just goes, so I remember when that happened thinking, this isn't just, you don't just log off. You can log off. You still, if you're paying attention to any political news, heard Trump and Vance talk about Kamala Harris, call her trash. They called her trash. They were suggesting she was a prostitute. So it's all connected. So I think logging off and looking away, it can be protective. And I in my previous answer was saying it's important, but you're not getting away from it. It's all connected.
No, it's all connected, but along those same lines and everything in that space isn't part of the problem that we have folks at the top of leadership that are as guilty of that kind of talk as well. I mean, I remember when the president of the United States basically said that it would be okay for him to grab a woman, and by the another term that is also used for cats and everything like that, and everything like that, and it was just almost kind of like laughed at. And even on this network, one of my cohorts and a good friend of mine, Jatobi, who is in the gaming space, talks about that whole simulation move that he made about a certain sexual act that he did during the presidential campaign, and folks didn't really gravitate toward that. They just let it slide and all in that space. So I just wondered if that not helping when we have the leader of the free world, if that's what the president of the United States is, as well as leaders of corporations being able to get away with stuff. Because just really quickly, and this is where the question comes in, there is this notion, some people, and I know it's an old notion because it even comes back to the race question and everything. There used to be a day and a time when people would say that they couldn't be racist because they quote unquote had a black friend and everything. And I think I think the equivalent of that is that some people will be like, I can't be a sexist or a misogynist because I treat my wife really nicely, and all along those lines, not understanding that just because you treat one person nicely in your family circle doesn't mean that you're treating everybody in that same gender the same way and everything like that. So I just wanted your take on this notion that misogyny and sexism is overused, because even here on this network, we've got some conservative people that are on the show sometimes, not my show, but other shows, and they definitely sometimes are thinking that they're being persecuted for the sins of the past when it comes to slavery and other things, or that they are being attacked even though they personally have not done anything against women.
Okay, wow. Well, there's a lot going on there. There's a lot going on there, Mark. Yeah, I remember, it's really hard to be reminded of that moment that you just brought us back to with that comment about Trump, that Access Hollywood tape, because I remember just being in the newsroom at that time and thinking very much that would be disqualifying. Like that would be a disqualifying event. I think it happened in October or something. We're like, oh, it's the October surprise. Like it was something, we thought it would be truly disqualifying. And so there was something very, I think that Trump's that first election, and even his re-election was so stunning, but only to certain, I don't want to say, I can't speak for other people. I think it was so stunning to us that language, that attitude, those kinds of behaviors would be, just excused, right? But also it just went to show that's the problem, right? That there's a whole segment of society that does not find that disqualifying. And I think that I think it was a wake-up call for some people, but I also feel like there are a lot of people who were, pointed to that election and point to his re-election as just further evidence of who we are, right? Like this is, especially the second election, right? This was the reason that it was so, I think it's so psychologically different and maybe even more devastating is because you're like, it's not an anomaly. Like it's not an anomaly that somebody who speaks like this about women and about immigrants and about people of color, the whole election, right? The way he's pronouncing Kamala Harris's name, right? It's just, so there's something so psychologically difficult and different, I think, about this moment that we're in, because we're like, no, actually, this is not, we knew, right? Like who we were getting, who this was. And still enough people felt like they were fine, right? With that kind of open misogyny and racism. And man, that language, I remember sitting in the car driving. I don't remember what this was towards the end of the election. I don't remember, maybe it was like some event at Madison Square Garden, and there were like, it was like, I don't remember what it was, but it was conservatives were all there, and I was driving. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Like it was a political event. These are leaders in this party. And the way they were speaking, I felt like I was listening to, I don't even have an analog for it. I thought I was listening to like 4chan live or something. It was crazy. It sounded insane to me. And I felt physically sort of ill about it. So I don't know. I don't really know how to respond to people who think that we're living in like sort of a post-sexist, post-racist like society, because then that's a level of sort of obtuseness that I can't even kind of get with. Like, I don't even know how to respond to that. Mm-hmm. But to your original thing, I think that, to your original point, I think that, Trump and that first election, that election, his ascension, many people say, was made possible because of social media, because of the way social media was harnessed by a lot of people with a lot of really, really toxic ideas about women, people of color, immigrants, trans people, right? And they were able to use these platforms to sow enough discord, to manipulate enough people, to create enough outrage, to elect this man. Yeah, I'm gonna punt it to you to continue to be in conversation with your conservative colleagues on this network.
Along the same lines and everything, because it's come up on this network a couple of times, and like I said, my friend Jacoby's brought it up. I brought it up many times and everything. How close, as a woman journalist and everything, do you feel we are to The Handmaid's Tale? Because I am a big fan of that book, and sometimes it feels like we are getting much too close to that reality than I would like us to be, and everything like that. But I just wondering, how close do you feel we are to that particular book?
I don't know how close we are, but I know that we're moving in the wrong direction. Like, I mean, there's a newsletter written by Jessica Valenti, feminist writer Jessica Valenti, and she writes a newsletter called Abortion Every Day. I think it's called Abortion Every Day. And she, sometimes when I'm reading it, I actually can't believe what I'm reading. Like, I am so stunned by the news and what is happening to sort of women in this country. I think, I'm not as well, I'm not as, I haven't read as much as I should about this new legislation that's sort of, they say, impacting married women and their ability to vote. But I do think, you see headlines like that, right? Okay. And I also think, again, many of us thought back in 2015 that a person who was running for president of the United States would be disqualified in the minds of most Americans from deserving that position and that level of power based on the way that he spoke about women, treated women. He had been accused, I don't remember, over a dozen women. And now also, I believe, was found guilty in a New York court for sexually abusing writer E. Jean Carroll and defaming her.
He definitely was arrested. I mean, not arrested, but convicted of that crime and all along those lines and everything. The law you were referring to, by the way, because I do know it because it's come up on the news a couple of times and everything along those lines, is this notion that you have to, because actually the show that goes on Fridays on a regular basis that Stella Adams does, who is a longtime activist in North Carolina and in a number of but actually she's around the country because she does a lot around housing and around race and a lot of other things. She's an African-American woman, but she does it on her show here on the network called Doing Justice Brings Joy. And she has mentioned this law that you're talking about a couple of times, because the law is basically that if you're supposed to have your original name that you had on your birth certificate. And
Birth
if you're
certificate,
married,
that's
most
right.
women that are married don't have that original name because
If
they
you
take
change
their
your name,
husband's
that's
name.
right. Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
so that would eliminate a large portion of women, which is actually really comes to my question. Because one of the things that came up even on another show we have here that Dr. Anthony does, who is a young lady, a teacher out of DC by way of Louisiana and other parts of the world and everything. But this notion that women, and particularly, I don't mean to put you in this category because you have mixed heritage and everything, but particularly white women seem
Yeah.
to have done to voted against their own interests, and that they voted even though they knew that it was bad for them, and all along those lines. So I just wanted your take on this notion that, and it wasn't just white women, there's some black women that voted for him and others that voted
Barely.
against. But this notion that some
Yeah.
people voted against their interests, knowing that the prices of food and other things that they have to deal with on a regular basis would be impacted everything. So what is your take on that, if I can put it in that kind of context?
I have a really, I don't want. I honestly, I don't even want to speak as somebody like who studies that phenomenon because I haven't studied that phenomenon. But I speak as a person who has just been. I'm just so disappointed. I remain so disappointed. You know, I think I can't. After this election. After this election, because white women again, right? Like more than in the first election, it was more than half of white women voted for Trump. I think it was the same here, maybe even more. And I think that at least in the 2016 election, it was something like 98% of Black women voted for Hillary Clinton. After this last election, I saw this trend on social media that was so rough. It was white women who were, I understand difficult things happen. You don't know how to cope. People are trying to make the best of it. So basically the white women who had voted for Kamala Harris were so, we're trying to figure out a way how to not have to be able to signal to each other, like, we voted for Kamala Harris. And they were talking on social media about how to do this and talking about maybe they would wear bracelets or, do things like that. And honestly, I felt embarrassed. I felt frustrated. I felt sort of, I don't know. I felt it felt hard to imagine being a person of color, like on those platforms and being so, I don't know, it felt trite to me. I don't want to criticize people's, the way people cope, right, with difficult things, but I found it really kind of hard to stomach. I certainly had conversations with people in my life, white women in my life who talked about being indecisive around this election. And I don't know. Honestly, I really have a hard time. Like, I talk about eggs all day long. You can talk about the border, like you can talk about all these things, but I am much more concerned with a fragile humanity that seems to just be dismissed and disregarded. I can't. It's really hard to sort of stomach.
I can agree with you because one of my frustrations is the fact, and I know that Rick Rosner, who's also on the network, and he used to work with Jimmy Kimmel and everything, he brings it up, and I brought it up a couple of times. Is I get very frustrated by like you do with those that voted against their own interests. I also get frustrated by those that didn't vote at all, because it was something like I think a third of the country that didn't vote at all and everything like that. So that can be very frustrating because you're thinking like in some way you did have a hand in what we're going through because you chose to sit on your hands and not take the action at all and everything like that. So that can be very frustrating as well and everything. So that's why I get some frustrating. I know that some people will be like, it's the lesser of two evils, and I don't know which evil I want to take and everything. But I'm
sorry, there is no comparison here. No comparison. I don't want to dismiss also people had very real, there were some people who had real concerns, who felt very frustrated and disenfranchised in this election for a bunch of reasons, right? Who didn't feel like they got to choose their candidate, and who were rightfully paying very close attention to what was happening and what continues to happen in Gaza. And, I don't want to, take away from the importance, right, of that sort of moral difficulty and kind of conundrum. I don't want to touch that, but I do think that it continues to be an incredible disappointment to me that white women continue to fail one another, and Black women who have continued to be prescient, right? Not just on, politically prescient, but even in thinking about my book. I mean, Black women, savvy Black women, digital feminists were talking about the issue of online abuse, disinformation online, well before it had entered mainstream discourse. People didn't listen, the platforms didn't take it seriously, and look at where we are. Oh, Mark, I don't think I can hear you.
That was my fault. What do you say to the people when they are talking to you and all along those lines, and they try to make a comparison between online abuse and what used to be very popular in the day? Like I said, I went to Marquette, which is not a football school, but we did have a good basketball program, just like we do even to this day. And some people be like, online conversations and these kind of banters that go on, and some of them are very offensive, are just a modern day version of barroom conversation. Because I've heard people that are trying to make the conversation between online and barroom conversation. Because, a lot of times in a barroom, people will say things that could be considered very offensive and all along those lines. So I do hear sometimes people making this comparison between, don't take it so seriously. It's just online banter. It's not anything different than what you might get if you went and chose to get caught in a bar or a nightclub or something like that. So what do you say?
You know what? If we all had full rights, autonomy, dignity, human rights, voting rights, if I didn't have to worry about being sexually assaulted every time I walked in my car at night, holding my keys, if I didn't feel, that, if we lived in a world where, we were free of violence and these things were not a reality, then okay, I guess it doesn't matter what you say on the internet. But again, this is all connected. These are not about discrete things that are said online. This is about attitudes that influence policy, law, how you're treated in your workplace, how you're treated in your family, right? How you're treated in every context in society. So no, I think that those conversations are indicative of cultural attitudes that inform everything about the way society operates. And I don't care if you're having it in a bar or, on X, it's a problem in every space.
No, I agree. It's a problem wherever it is and everything. And there's an epidemic in one of our other shows. I hate to keep plugging some of our shows, but one of the shows on Sunday talks about bullying and the epidemic of bullying. It's actually done by a friend of mine, Stephanie Hockenhall, and her son, Gene, who is a musician. I think she's more like a business coach / counselor, and a variety of other careers as well. But they talk about this epidemic of bullying, and mental health and the social media does come up quite a bit and everything along those lines. So I just wanted your thoughts around online bullying and also how it impacts just mental health in general. Because I would say that we're in the middle, and it was even before the pandemic, of a mental health crisis, because a lot of times we don't know how to deal with the various mental health issues that are going on when they are taking place. I know that's something you've written about is mental health, and I'm a big advocate for us having as much as we can total health, even though I need to get out at some point and get some walking in today so I can have the physical health. But I am a big supporter of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health and everything like that. But I just wanted your take on this online abuse and how it's impacting our mental health.
Thanks for asking that, Mark. This project really started because I felt like the mandate that was sometimes explicit and other times maybe less so more implicit, but the sort of notion that you feel is circulating most readily and accessibly is that if you're going to operate in these spaces, if you're going to be online at all, whatever you're doing, you're here to just make money or to talk to your friends or self-define or maybe agitate or publicly write, publicly think. If you're going to be here, you have to be able to ignore some level of this in order to sort of participate. And I think sometimes when we say ignore, we mean don't react. Right. And I think other times when people say ignore it, they mean don't feel. And the latter part was always something that bothered me, because I did feel and do feel the things that people do and say to me online. I'm not even also aspiring to a life where I feel less. I think that's stoicism is a sort of white male supremacist value. I don't aspire to that. But it's just so fundamentally at odds with what we know about human beings, right? Humans were not built to ignore language. We made language, we created it to connect and, again, self-define, to make bonds. And we have, we also use it to be malicious and to exclude people and to reject people and to categorize people. We're not built to ignore language. The parts of our brain that process language are the same parts of our brain that adjust our glucose and our heart rates and manage our immune systems, right? So you're not built to ignore language. The power of words is not a metaphor. And also you're always having sort of physiological responses to threat, right? So some of these attacks are extremely threatening. You're having responses. So this is all to say that, of course, these things are impacting us. They're impacting us psychologically, physiologically, physically, sometimes in a long-term way. We discussed a little bit. Also, it can impact you reputationally, economically. Women that I interviewed for the book, some said they had to increase their anxiety medication to be able to cope with their experiences. Some were clinically depressed. Some were suicidal, had suicidal thoughts in response to some of this abuse. And so some of the mental health impacts are very tangible. You can kind of get your hands around it. But I also think that there's other kinds of effects that are a little bit harder to notice and define. And I certainly felt this myself. And I wonder if you have felt this in your own kind of work. But there's also this kind of just, sort of cynicism, right? This disillusionment about what you're doing and whether it matters. And if you're here kind of doing what you kind of came here to do, right? So there's this subtle sort of maybe a loss of identity or a kind of slower sort of annihilation of the self. And I think that it's harder to explain that, articulate that, even identify that for yourself. But to me, some of that is that kind of invisible stuff is the most not the most distressing, but it's also distressing, right? It is such a difficult part of the experience. And so, yeah, I just think that one of the things that I felt was really important with this project, with this book, was to just be really attentive to what it really means to have this experience, right? What does it mean on a deep, intimate level, going into the body, going into the mind? And I think that when you do that, you really see that these experiences are always having an impact, right? It's different for every person based on your identity, your resources, your resiliencies, but nobody's ignoring it, right? We're just coping in different ways and making meaning in different ways.
Yeah, coping in different ways, making meaning in different ways. And a lot of times we play into the stereotypes. As you were talking, I was just thinking about another friend's podcast, and she does it regularly. She had these women on that were talking about this notion of what is called the soft life and everything like that. So it's basically the kind of that old notion of, I think, the guy being in charge and the woman being the homemaker and all in that kind of space. But it's a term, and that's the first time I had heard the term. And I don't think it's just strictly that you have to be having those time of terms and everything within the soft life, but it's definitely I guess the women are being more softer and the men are more hard in that stereotype kind of way and everything. But I mentioned that I knew some people on that particular podcast that were truck drivers, and they were women truck drivers, and they automatically assumed that they were not attractive and all along those lines. So sometimes there is self-stereotypes as well. So I just wondering your take on that, and if the book deals with that, because I hear that one of your people that you interviewed was a comedian who actually uses, which I think is a good disarming tool, kind of comedy to disrupt the harassment that she might even get with some of her feminist humor. And I think you also had talked to an OBGYN who channeled her anger in her social media debates and everything like that. So I just wanted your take on those people in the book, and also this notion of how we sometimes internalize the messages that are being fed to us.
I mean, yeah, I don't think you, of course we internalize it. I mean, even just what I was saying earlier about, I mean, when I first started to experience my abuse, I was trying very hard to suppress whatever, the feelings that I was having, and to compartmentalize it to the extent that I could. And I don't think that, I think compartmentalization is like it's a great skill. We all have to use it from time to time to cope with any kind of difficulty in our lives. But I think that initially I was trying to deal with my abuse in the way that, men deal with difficulty, right? Like it was again to sort of, because we were being told that if we have a reaction to these things that we're fragile or we're overwrought or we're too weak or like we don't belong in these spaces. So it's like, oh, better start acting more like the incels online or whatever. I don't even know, but I don't want to uphold that, right? Like as a value to just be, to be stoic and to feel less. So yeah, I think we all internalize sexism and misogyny, and we all have, internalized, some of us have internalized racism, homophobia, whatever it is. But to your question on I think that, speaking about some of the women that I interviewed, it was very important to me because I'm a person who was having a very specific experience online as a journalist, based on the things I was writing because of my, racial identity and my gender identity, right? I was having my own specific kind of experience. But just because the abuse sort of shares some of the same features doesn't mean we all experience it the same way, right? So I needed a lot of diversity, or I felt like I wanted a lot of diversity in terms of the subjects. So I wanted diversity. Thinking back to your very earlier question around ageism, I wanted people of, who kind of grew up with some of this technology, right? Like I'm not a digital native. I wanted diversity in terms of age and in terms of class and in terms of race and disability status. And, I have a chapter that follows a trans woman. I have a chapter that follows a tradeswoman. And I wanted also diversity in terms of occupation. So yes, I interviewed a comedian and an OBGYN. And yeah, I think that it's interesting. I structured the book in such a way that each chapter profiles a woman, uses their story to sort of open up questions about sort of larger social, political, psychological issues. And then at the end at the end of each chapter, talks about a specific way that woman coped. And I structured it the way that I did. But the truth is that, any one of those stories could have been put in a different kind of order or different sort of place, right? Because we're not ever just doing a single thing, right? So the feminist comedian absolutely uses humor to cope, but she also uses compartmentalization, and she also gets angry, and she also externalizes her experience, and she also probably occasionally has to log off, right? So it's all to say that, we are always, whether or not we're conscious of it, we're always using these, psychological mitigations. We might not have the vocabulary for it. And it's so important. We have to do these things because discrimination is terrible for health. It's so bad for health. So we have to do these things. But I think if there's a thought that I would want to leave people with, it's, sometimes I feel like I'm underselling the project by saying this, but it's important to have a deeper vocabulary for what's happening to you. It's really helpful. It can sort of reduce the experience of pain to know what's happening to you and to have language for it and to sort of see the things that you're doing, how they benefit you and what the drawbacks are. But ultimately, all of these coping mechanisms are really just mitigations unless we're going to make those kinds of structural changes, right? Policy changes, platform changes, legal changes, cultural changes that make it so we can, live in a world that is free of oppression, right? These are all just like mitigations. We're unless you're going to solve those, address those bigger problems, right? You're just because you're going to keep dealing with it offline and online.
You're going to deal with it for a while and everything. Like I said, I don't have any children of my own, but my nephews are 15 and 16 as of this year. Actually, later on in this year in August, they'll be 16 and 17. And I do know that you've got a child of your own. I don't know whether it's a boy or a girl or anything. But two girls. How do you get them to understand what's going on? Because I'm thinking that they're probably at that age where they can start asking you questions like being probably preteens or young ladies and everything. So how do you bring this awareness to them? Like I know when my nephews were born, my dad would actually go out and take them into nature. My brother and them will even have conversations around politics and around things, even as they are teenagers and all along those lines. So how do you bring that conversation? I've used the example of my dad because he was doing that when they were like pre-elementary school and everything like that before they'd even started going to school and everything. So how do you bring these difficult issues to your daughters?
It's such a good question. It's such a fair question. I don't know that I'm doing it very successfully. I do like to talk. So I'm always sort of in conversation with them about everything. I think I try very hard to connect their experiences to something larger. I'm always trying, because I think that, you know, I came into my feminism sort of slowly and arguably kind of late. You think that as things are happening to you in your life, that they are personal. Like these are personal challenges and personal problems and personal attacks or personal difficulties. And it is so liberating and so important and exciting and also scary, but just, I think, useful to know that what you are experiencing is connected to something much larger, whether it's a history, right, or a larger kind of political project. Or I think words like sexism and racism, things like that, still don't really penetrate. I mean, my kids are really young. They're really little. I mean, my littlest is 5. But I do try to talk about these concepts. I've tried to talk to my book about them. They're sort of not interested in me. It's hard to kind of keep their attention. But I think that they recognize that I look at the world. I think that they understand our values, right? Like, I think that they understand our values. And I think that they understand when something is kind of butting up against that value or is antithetical to that value. They try to express it in their own language. Like my littlest said the other day, because Trump came on like our Alexa. I need to get rid of that Alexa, actually, now that I say that out loud. But Trump came on the Alexa and my littlest was like, I bet he doesn't even brush his teeth, because she just, like, she doesn't have the language to explain why, you know, this person is viewed as somebody who is unhealthy or unsafe, right? Yeah. But she knows that we believe that to be true, and so she's trying to find her own language for it. But I think it's just constantly being in conversation and paying really close attention to them, and then letting them to, you know, when they have a question, you know, putting down whatever it is you're doing, right? Like, and making that eye contact and really trying to focus and speak in that way. My children are a part of this book because I think a lot about the world that they're going to inherit, and in every context, right? And particularly how technology is going to influence and impact their lives. So, you know, it's something that's always on my mind.
No, it definitely would be on your mind, because I know that there have been even studies out there that they have said that a lot of people were choosing not to have kids until much later in life, if at all. And some of that was because of fear of what this world will look like and what
exactly
kids will be inheriting. So even though, like I said, even though my nephews are in the world and are successful teenagers and all along that line, I know that my brother and myself and their grandparents, my parents and their parents, well, my brother and my parents, oftentimes are sitting there wondering what kind of world are they inheriting. And, you know, I don't know that we'll be rushing them to get hitched, if I can use that old-fashioned term, and all along those lines and everything. But definitely you wonder what kind of life and world they will inherit when we seem to be spiraling toward madness and everything like that.
Yeah. So, for sure.
It can be very scary in that sense. I do have to teach you about something before I get back to some more serious stuff, and we can get ready to wrap up shortly and everything. But one of the things and this is about the journalism field and everything, and this is kind of off the topic, but just like I have some fun with my shows as well and everything. I'm going to tell you that because you are a major reporter at USA Today and everything.
Well, actually, I'm not anymore. I
said yes, it was. I said it was.
Yes, okay, it was. Okay, sorry. Some people have said yes.
I used to have a problem with the USA Today, and part of it was a grammar thing, because I used to jokingly call it USA Today, because I really think that it needs to have periods in the middle of USA Today and everything, because that was my joke. I would be like, you talk about USA Today? Because I'm going like, it's supposed to have periods in between if we're doing USA Today as in United States of America. So that was just a little fun joke to share with you, because I was going like, wait a minute, I remember that when I used to pick that paper up regularly, and I saw amazing journalism when that paper first came out as the first and maybe one of the only national papers, even though I guess the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and others can argue that they are national as well, but one that was created as a national newspaper.
Yes,
there was an African-American newspaper that was created as a national paper too, but I think it disappeared altogether, and I can't even remember its name and all along those lines, but it was there for a hot second and everything like that. But I just had to share that with you because I'm like,
no, I like that because I also think it's funny. Like people do, maybe it would have helped. Like maybe it was a pretty good idea because people still get the name. People sometimes when I say I work at USA Today, like we'll call it like US News or World Report. Like there's just some confusion. Or when I used to work at USA Today, former reporter at USA Today, there is something that I've had people drop the A. They just say
right.
US Today. Like so. Anyway, it is a problem, Mark. So maybe that was the solution, or
maybe that was the solution. You just need to put the period there since that's what it looks like on the typical maps and everything like that.
Yeah.
Because I'm feel like, wait a minute, there's no period there, so that's the issue. But yes, just along those same lines and everything. Because I was going to come back to something you said earlier, because I got to come back to that, and I was along those lines. What is it about journalism that didn't have you thinking that you were an activist? Because to me, and just having grown up and everything, I've always thought of journalists as activists. Maybe you didn't have the same thing of doing protests like I did when I was a young person, or even having folks that like my dad and mom that were in the civil rights movement, and even dad at one point created a farm co-op called And a Mule, as in 40 acres and a mule, and everything like that. But so I definitely grew up around that. And like I said, the environmental justice movement started in Warren County to some degree when those people were dumping chemicals in rural North Carolina and Southern Virginia. And that kind of like where the environmental justice movement was birthed at. So a lot of people credited that. I think even Ben Chavis credited in that space as well and everything. But I just wondered your thoughts as to why you don't consider maybe journalism as much of activism as I do and everything like that.
Yeah. I think it's a fair question. So, okay, let me think about it. I mean, I think that there's definitely, when you are at a national news organization, you follow certain standards, right? And standards and ethics, you have to follow certain kind of, they have policies, right, about behavior that is acceptable and behavior that is not acceptable as a journalist, like as a news organization, right? Certain standards. And I remember, I think that in reflecting back to when I first really started to report on gender as like a full-time beat, my news organization told me that I could not attend the Women's March, the 2017 Women's March, unless I was covering it. So I couldn't go as a citizen, as a woman. That would be a violation. And so I think that there's probably, I think that a lot of newsrooms are trying to figure this out, right? Or have been trying to kind of figure this out, especially with social media, right? Like how do you be a journalist, but also be a person, and speak, I think both those things, right? Like how do you be how do you be a journalist, and how do you kind of like be a human?
I understand where they was going, because they were probably thinking objectivity, and of course journalists want to be as objective as possible. I think we all have our biases and all along those lines, but I was a fan even growing up, and I don't know if you studied them in journalism and everything, and I do sometimes think you might have gone way overboard at everything. But when you would say that they didn't want you to attend the Women's March and everything, I'm going like, well, Hunter S. Thompson would have had a serious problem with that, because I was a fan of gonzo journalism, which is like basically fear and loathing, whether it was the Las Vegas political convention or whether it was, I think there was a fear and loathing in Las Vegas, fear and loathing. I forget what they all were, but I know it was basically him ingraining himself in the story.
Yes, that. What is it? That new journalism, right?
Gonzo journalism, I think is what it was called back then.
So I think to answer your question, I think some of it is the culture of where you sort of come up as a journalist, but I also do think that, again, because of, we think about right now, there are so many voices online, and there's so many voices that are important, and there's so many voices that are problematic, but you have now this democratization, right? Anybody can really kind of start a podcast. Anybody, you can have a platform if you want to have a platform, and you can speak on anything. And in some ways, this is excellent. And in other ways, it makes me really think about how misunderstood journalism is, because as journalists, again, we have certain standards that we have to follow. And and ethics that we are keeping in mind when we tell stories. We can't just say anything, write anything. Like, we have to, make sure that the person that we're interviewing is credible. Sometimes we have to have multiple sources on a story before we can go out with it, right, and publish and say this thing. We have, standards around when we can grant somebody anonymity. We have standards around, when something is on the record, when something's off the record, when something's on background. Like, there's so many ways that we kind of conduct ourselves, right? That are within these, we have parameters, we have, constraints, and we have ethics, and we have standards. And I think that that's what differentiates us from every, other sort of person who might be online or in places doing, again, excellent things, people doing sort of malicious things.
But Aaliyah, the flip side of that, and I hear what you're saying, the flip side of that is that we also have organizations that are using the term journalism or using the term that they are journalists, but we can tell that they are clearly biased. And I'll give you two examples on both sides, because I watch one of them, and all along those lines, and the other one I don't watch, even though he's probably the one that's more known, even though the one I'm getting ready to mention overtook the one that I'm going to mention secondly. But Midas Touch is clearly liberal. And yes, I do sometimes go on YouTube and see what Midas Touch is saying about the various things that are going on in the current administration and all along those lines. And I can say the same thing about Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is clearly biased the other way, and I don't listen to a lot of Joe Rogan and everything along those lines. But I just wondering, have we got to the point, and I mentioned being in Clubhouse, and I remember being in rooms of different sorts, whether it was a room around media or it was a room around filmmaking or rooms around a number of other things, and they would have their moderators and people that would try to dictate who came up or down in the discussions and everything. I think Discord does some similar kind of stuff. But if we got to the point where everybody is a journalist and therefore there's not enough fact checking going on within the journalism, or people are just letting people run rampant with their opinions and everything like that. I don't know your thoughts, but sometimes even when I used to go into Clubhouse, I'm going like, there is no basis for what you're saying, but it sounds good and you've got a good theory and everything, but there is no journalistic background into what you're saying and everything. I think that's part of my problem with I got still problems with the Trump administration, but part of my problem is that he's hired a bunch of people that aren't qualified for their jobs. Why we got a wrestling head as the head of education, and why RFK Jr. is head of health is beyond me. But
I hear you. I mean, listen, we're talking about a huge issue, right? Like a multifaceted issue. And I don't mean to not, to be evasive, but I think that there are genuine critiques to make of journalists and journalism and the structure of it and the model of it and the business model of it and all the things. I mean, I have a tough time with broadcast news. I have a tough time with local news where things just feel very out of context. I have people in my family who only watch local news. And when I watch local news, I'm mad like all the time, because I don't feel like there's any context for those headlines, or not enough context for their headlines. I certainly, I do have problems sometimes watching, some of these, broadcast news programs, even when I should feel sort of morally kind of aligned, right? Like with what they're doing based on my kind of identity as a feminist writer. So I think that there's critiques to make, but again, I just would stress that there is a difference between activism and I think that advocacy journalism is obviously like a thing, and that's like a brand of work. And I think that, when I was leaving, when I was on my way out of USA Today, I felt like it was a couple of years before I left. I feel like there were conversations about the mission of our organization. And it was not just to tell the truth for truth's sake, right? It's to tell the truth because we believe that to tell the truth creates a healthier democracy, a healthier society, healthier communities, healthier people. And that is a shared goal, I think, right, between us and and some other sort of fields and people sort of doing work towards, anti-violence work,
Right.
whatever it is, right? But I still do think their difference is because of those, standards and ethics, because, journalists get in trouble a lot of time, sometimes for reporting certain things because they, they anger, right? Like activists on both sides. And I think that that's kind of
No,
okay.
yeah, they definitely
There's a
anger.
role for both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They definitely anger journalists activists on both sides. But the other thing that they sometimes don't do, and that's one of the reasons I like Pod TV, is because it lets me bring up some of these issues and everything, is that we sometimes get too caught up in a myopic lens, for lack of a better term. And there's a lot of stories. I mean, the world is a big world, and there's like some 200 plus countries, and there are a lot of the parts of the world that we don't hardly cover at all as journalists. And even USA Today didn't always cover them because it was doing that snapshot kind of journalism. But I do think y'all did a better job when you were working than a lot of other people did. But I mean, that's a lot of times I get frustrated going like, there's a whole series of countries on the continent of Africa that people don't even know what the heck is going on in those various countries. I'm not saying you got to know everything in every country, but I do think that we don't do a good job of reporting the global landscape that we're part of. And I think that that's part of the appeal of social media, is that people were hearing voices from other parts of the world that they didn't always hear.
That's right. That's right. That's why we've been able to, I remember after October 7th thinking that would follow the cycle of a typical news story, because, you're in newsrooms and like, okay, like this is going to be the biggest thing for a week or two or whatever it is. And then that we're going to cycle to the next thing. And that can be really frustrating too. So I even did some reporting on those kinds of scripts, right? Those kind of cultural scripts, right? For how we sort of deal with these things. But that story did not go away. And it did not go away in large part because of activists and journalists and people on the ground, journalists on the ground, having access to these platforms, right? To keep that story alive and going. So I agree with that point.
To keep that story going and keeping it like that. But even to your point that you just made, that was my frustration, not so much with activism, but society in general. My dad did a art piece. He's an artist and a photographer, and among the other things that he's done that I've referenced and everything, Mom's done work in the foundation field. She actually did was the first president of the Golden Leaf Foundation, which is the tobacco settlement money that was getting people out of the tobacco industry, which we know can have its own negative things. But his artwork that he did was called Thoughts and Prayers, and it was basically a renegade piece. And so it was like the old, well, not the old, but the thing that you pull down for fire alarms and everything that are in most offices. And in that, he had a note card that said Thoughts and Prayers, and he placed it in different places. That's why I call it renegade art, because it was part of an actual art exhibit, but then he also placed it around communities and everything. And part of his notion was this notion that we love giving platitudes about thoughts and prayers, but we don't do enough follow up on it. It's just thoughts and prayers, and you're not doing any action, whether that's money, whether that's support, whether that's if a person's homeless, actually giving them a home and everything like that. So that's kind of the notion of what the art piece was. And I agree with him, because part of what happens with, like, say, Katrina, we get all excited and we want to help the people, or even Sandy. And I can't remember where you live at and everything, but even Sandy up there.
No, Sandy, New York. Yeah, Sandy was.
Everybody wanted to give support and everything, or even 9/11 way back when, well, not way back then, but about 20 plus years ago and everything. Everybody was engaged and want to give support, but then it's like, when's the next disaster happen? And then we forget the last disaster. We haven't even solved the last disaster.
That's right. I guess I was thinking one other thing I want to say on your point, though, on that journalism activist piece. So I don't really want to talk about the activist piece, but I just want to mention, I guess, that, when I said that USA Today, told people at the newsroom that you couldn't go to the Women's March unless you were covering it. At the time, I did kind of accept that. And now I think, I don't know if I would, but I think there is something interesting also that has happened with a lot of, I think, younger journalists who definitely have an enormous amount of respect for the institution of journalism, but take issue with some of these more rigid kind of policies around how they can conduct their work, how they can do their reporting, and how they can speak about their work and their reporting and their findings on social media and in public settings. And in response to some of that frustration are venturing out and doing their own sort of independent work. And I think that is incredibly valuable, and that makes a lot of sense. And I think that there are a lot of independent journalists that are doing an excellent job. I still feel like that is different from, the Joe Rogans of the world, right? Like that is something different. And I think it is hard to explain. I think that we haven't really accommodated to these challenges to be able to explain to viewers, to readers, to people, to a public, how do you differentiate between these things? How do you differentiate between an independent journalist and a creator who is weaponizing misogyny online to make money? Like, how do you differentiate, and so I think that it really behooves us to do better media literacy around this stuff, because I even struggle with it sometimes. So it's just a further.
And I think part of that comes even down to the whole notion of the study of journalism. Because like I said, I went to Marquette. I know you said you went to Syracuse, but I've got friends that teach at North Carolina Central University, some including my dad that used to, he taught at UNC. He's retired now from teaching, even though his artwork he's still doing. But I have friends at these different